Coach Tyler here, along with Dr. Michael Ray, owners of CrossFit Callisto. Also, Dr. Michael Ray is owner of Shenandoah Valley Performance Clinic. Today we're going to talk to you about squat depth, and it's a big topic recently. It's really come up in social media, it's come up in the CrossFit community, as well as in other athletic endeavors. So Dr. Ray is going to kind of give us a background, as well as discuss what proper depth actually means. Dr. Ray?
Yeah. So today we're going to talk about squatting, as Coach Tyler was saying, and there's kind of two big topics I want to hit on today. First, how we coach squatting with our new athletes. If we have someone brand new that's not very familiar with squatting, whether just their body weight or actually squatting with the barbell, kind of some cueing that we use for these athletes. So we hope to make it as efficient and as effective as possible with their time at our time. And I also want to talk about something that's usually on the concern of some coaches and many athletes is how far down should they be squatting? What is an appropriate depth? So let's start off with talking about external versus internal focus for cueing as a coach on the athlete. So if you're familiar with any motor learning research that's been going on in the past couple of years, you'd be familiar with the name of Dr. Wolf, and she can be attributed for much of this research, so I do want to give her credit for this. But if we're talking to a new athlete and we're dealing with squatting, we're going to start off with a couple of basic things. So we want to have an external focus versus an internal. So what does that mean? So external focus means that we're bringing the athlete aware of the movement, but without bringing awareness to like a specific body part or internally how they're thinking about how to complete the movement. So traditionally, I would coach the squat with a couple of things that I want to happen. I want a vertical torso, so I want the chest up and the shoulder blades back. I want them to maintain that position throughout the movement. I want a tripod foot, so I want big toe, little toe, and heel in contact with the ground, so whole foot contact. I want to have their hips below their knees as they're squatting or going down to a comfortable depth that they can do without pain for range of motion. And so these are the things that I'm trying to accomplish. But if I give an athlete all of these kind of things to check off their list while squatting, it becomes a little bit problematic and a bit overwhelming, especially for new athletes. So what we try to do is we try to give more generalized cueing that's an external focus. So for things like this, if I want to get a vertical torso, I'm going to have them, if the bar's on their back, I'm going to say bend the bar. So they're going to pull that bar down and back, which is going to do everything I want it to do. It's going to bring the chest up and out. It's going to bring the shoulder blades down and back. And now they have appropriately positioned their upper body for squatting. The second thing I'm going to tell them to do is rip the ground apart. So if they're positioned on the ground, they're actually going to try to separate that ground away, as if we're thinking about maybe an earthquake occurred and a crack's in the ground. I want them to try to open up that crack and separate their feet apart or rip the ground apart. So this is going to do a lot of things. It's going to get this tripod foot that I want. It's going to engage that big toe. It's going to resist a valgus moment while squatting. It's going to do a lot of different things, but they're going to not be focused on all these things. They're just going to try to separate the ground, which is much more effective. Then I'm going to tell them lower towards the ground. Now this is where it can get a little fuzzy as far as squat depth and how to accomplish that appropriately. But that's going to be the first cue I give them. And then if I need to switch it to an internal focus, or I need to give a prop or something like that, like a box or some depth cue, I can do that. But I want to start very general and very basic first. And then the final cue is going to be drive the ground away or drive the world away as they're standing back up. So we found, and I think most of the coaching world at this point has found, that external focus is much easier for an athlete to digest and to understand and be effective with squatting and maximize its time and efficiency. With that said, if I need to, I can go to internal focuses to kind of clean up technique as we move on and they become more proficient in the movement. So let's take a look at one of our athletes with squatting and kind of show how these cues can be effective for them. All right, so we have athlete Josh here. He's an experienced squatter. He's been doing this for quite some time. But we're going to see how these external cues of focus help him get into good positioning for squatting, and it's not overcomplicating the movement. So what we're going to have our athlete do initially is they're going to step up under the barbell. We're not going to get into things like low bar or high bar right now, and just that's a whole other topic for another time. But we're just concerned they're getting the bar evenly positioned on the back. So then they're going to stand up with the bar. They're going to take a slight step outside of the rig. And then with the external focus, all I'm going to tell them, a few basic things, is that they're going to pick the positioning of the feet. I'm really not going to get into width stance or anything like that. They're going to find a position that's comfortable for them. And maybe we talked about this a little bit in more detail ahead of time before now. So then I'm going to tell him, I want him to bend the bar over his back. And you're going to see immediately when he goes from a relaxed position to bending the bar over his back. His shoulder blades are going to drop down and back. His chest is going to come up. And he's going to be prepared to squat with a vertical torso. And we want him to maintain that throughout the movement. So we may cue it again as he's lowering down. And then I'm going to tell him I want him to separate the ground with his feet or try to rip the ground apart. And then that's going to turn everything on with external rotator glutes. And it's going to get him ready to squat. So now he's going to lower down to a comfortable squat depth. Still bending that bar over his back. Still squeezing the ground, ripping the ground apart. And then he's just going to stand up, pushing the ground away. All right? Good. Thank you, Jeff. All right, so that is how we coach a new athlete for the squatting movement. Next thing I want to transition into is talking about depth and a little bit of pseudoscience that seems to be out there with this idea, and somehow still misconceptions that are going on even in 2016. So the idea that we shouldn't be squatting below parallel or at full depth or full knee flexion, something that came out back in about the 60s. A guy by the name of Carl Klein, who was at the University of Texas, I believe, wanted to take a look at what happens with deep squatting with athletes and with their ligaments specifically. So he did a study on this. He used kind of a tool that he manufactured to measure knee laxity and responses. And so he released a study called Deep Squat Exercise as utilized in weight training for athletes and its effects on the ligaments of the knee. And so when this got released, it basically said that squatting deep was bad for the knee, and it can cause ligament laxity and all this other stuff. The AMA actually took a position statement on it and said athletes shouldn't be squatting deep. And from there, from the 60s on, it basically took off like wildfire. And even today, in 2016, we see coaches and clinicians telling athletes, don't squat deep, it's going to be bad for your knees. Now, with that said, obviously, if we're wanting direct transition over to activities of daily living or sport-specific exercises, then we're going to look at doing full ranges of motion, regardless of whether it's squatting or other things, other movement patterns. So just from an intuitive logistics kind of standpoint, we want people going through full range of motion. With that said, though, we need the evidence to back up what we're saying, and so that way we know we're actually having a true effect and we're not just having a confirmation bias. So new evidence has been emerging, obviously, since the 60s that's taking a look at, well, is this true with forces on the knee while squatting? One article in particular that I want to mention today is Hartman, and he released this article in 2013. This is titled The Analysis of the Load on the Knee Joint and Vertebral Column with Changes in Squatting Depth and Weight Load. Ultimately, what Hartman found, one of the findings, was that compressive forces were actually lessened at deeper knee flexion angles. Knee flexion angles just meaning as you're lowering down, there's a greater knee flexion. That these compressive forces were actually not increasing, therefore they're most likely not being detrimental to the knee. Now, one of his hypotheses is that there's this idea called the wrapping effect, and maybe that's having a protective mechanism on the knee. When I look through the literature, thus far what we've found is that there's not a whole lot of support for this idea of the wrapping effect. Now, with that said, I still would argue that decreased compressive forces on the knee while squatting is a good thing, and that squatting to depth, full depth, isn't going to cause detrimental effects for the athlete or down the road for the athlete. So we just need to consider that when we're looking at this, and I'm sure there's going to be more research that comes out down the road that's examining that wrapping effect and taking a little bit closer look what kinematically is happening at the knee with that. But we can see that obviously this study had a lot of issues to it. I'm not going to go through all of them, but mainly a big confirmation bias as far as the methodology and execution of this study, and then a bit of too much generalization towards the findings, and they were kind of blown out of proportion. So even still today, we're trying to combat what this study found. And I've heard it even as early as this week, like athletes shouldn't be squatting to full depth because it's going to be injurious to their knees. And we just don't have any evidence to state that or support that or to correlate to that. And then, in fact, what we're actually seeing with new evidence emerging is that the forces on the knee actually decrease as you're getting to full depth, the compressive forces. And so we know, obviously, if an athlete does something that they haven't previously adapted to, whether it's too much volume or too much intensity, then yeah, we can cause injuries, but that's not looking at this type of injury. It's not causing laxity to the knee or anything like that. In fact, what we're finding more and more is it could be a protective mechanism for the knee, strengthening the athlete through full range of motion. So that's kind of my rant on squat depth and discussing how we coach our new athletes as they come into CrossFit Callisto, or if I'm working with someone in the clinic as well. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. You can shoot us an email at info@crossfitcallisto.com, or you can email me at my practice at info@svperformanceclinic.com. Check us out on the website, www.crossfitcallisto.com. Thanks for listening in.